up to Daniel chapter 7 and 8, and so that's where we're going to be today. So some of you today are going to be extremely excited because we're in the prophecy part in the book of Daniel, while others of you wish we had stopped at chapter 6 because you don't like all the prophecy stuff. So there's a lot of weird stuff that goes on in these chapters, kind of the visions that's going on. And I'll be honest with you, it's a little intimidating for me to preach it, just shooting straight with you. Daniel in these dreams has visions of beasts and of dragons and of the Antichrist, of the end times, and all of it can be just a little bit unsettling and a little bit just intimidating trying to preach it. Now, I know there's some people out there that just absolutely love this stuff. Like your mouth drools just when you hear about the end times, right? You bring out all your charts and your graphs and you're just kind of like, I'm ready for it, Pastor. Like, give it to me. Like, I've been hungry for you to preach on this for 8 years. And so, listen, I grew up in the 90s. Like I was born in the 80s, but I really just grew up in the 90s. And I don't believe there was another time in history. This is just my opinion. Like, this isn't fact or anything like that. But there was never, to me, there was not another part in time where people loved the end times more than the 90s, I felt like. That's when the Left Behind series started, you know. You had all these prophecy conferences that you could go to that they would tell you all these great things about how it's all coming together and everything's fitting together. Pastors would make rapture jokes like there was no tomorrow. Thank you. All right. And so, yeah, you caught that. Thank you. That was my one joke this sermon, and you guys got it. So thank you for catching it. So one of the ways that you would fill your church back in the 90s was to speak on the end times, right? And it would just pack out the whole place. And unfortunately, we didn't pack out the place today because I guess nobody's wanting to hear about it anymore. And so here we are, and I'm speaking on the end times, all right? But before we get into this passage, let me remind you kind of everything that's coming around and how the book of Daniel is set up. So the first half of the book, chapters 1 through 6, is primarily written in Aramaic. The first chapter is written in Hebrew, like the rest of the Old Testament. Then kind of the rest of those chapters are written in Aramaic, basically because they were in Babylon when those chapters were written. And so it chronicles the adventures of kind of these 4 Hebrew immigrants who were exiled to live in Babylon, and how they sought to live faithfully in the midst of a hostile culture which they were taken captive in. And so Daniel shows us that it is possible to thrive in a culture that's hostile to what you believe in that environment. And so these first chapters were written mostly in Aramaic because, like I said, was the language of Babylon, because the focus was how are we to shine in Babylon for the gospel. Well, chapter 7 shifts back to Hebrew language because all these prophecies are specifically given to God's people to help them prepare for the future. So let me ask you this. What word characterizes you about your attitude towards the future? Is it stressful or is it peaceful? Which word characterizes you? Are you the kind of person who always kind of gets depressed about what's going on in the world? Or are you addicted to cable news, maybe always griping about how the world is and how it's a bad place, and you kind of like, what kind of world are we leaving our kids? Does that characterize you? Or are you the kind of person, while you're concerned about the future, you have a sense of optimism about what God is doing in the world? So in a word, what word characterizes you? Are you stressful or are you peaceful? And so how do you look at the future? And I believe Daniel's prophecy makes the difference between these two attitudes. Now, we left off in chapter 6, and Daniel was around 80 years old. Remember, that's kind of where we left off. Now in Daniel 7, we kind of go back a few years, and Daniel's is in his mid-60s at this point. And there's a lot of details in these chapters. Daniel has dreams, has bears, leopards with wings, and talking horns, chariots with wheels of fire. And you read it for the first time, you're kind of concerned like that Daniel might need to get drug tested with all these things that he's seeing. Is like, these are weird things. But what I want to show you that running through all these details is a simple, easy to follow message that's weaving in and out through this. So hang on, don't get lost in the details, because the way I'll describe this passage is kind of like riding It's a Small World at Disney. Okay, now follow me here. All right, that ride, if you've never been on, is basically an assault on your senses. All right, You ride through this little river, and you have these little people singing and dancing and turning and doing all that, singing the same exact song over and over again. Now, it may have a different flair to the song. It will be in a different language, but through it all, these same people are singing the same song. And basically what's happening, you have a river bringing you through that entire ride, bringing you through all the different areas, and over again, that song is singing the same thing over and over again. And by the end of the day, you're going to be singing that song in your head the entire day, asking God to make it stop. All right? And so basically that's this passage, all right? There's a lot of things coming at you. There's a lot of different things and a lot of different things, but there's a river moving you through it, and at the end you will see the dominant song being sung throughout this entire passage. So does that make sense? So just look at this as it's a small world, okay? So here we go. Daniel chapter 7, start in verse 2 with me. So Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea." Now, in the Old Testament, just let me explain something real quick. Beasts are metaphors for world governments. So we're looking at four kingdoms here, okay? So think of the beast as kingdoms. That's what this is representing. Verse 4. "The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it." So this is representing Babylon, okay? So the first beast is representing Babylon. The wings getting torn off represents God humbling Nebuchadnezzar by making him basically go insane, after which he lifted up off the ground and gave him back his human mind, which represents him coming back to his senses and his conversion to Christ, or to God, which we saw in chapter 4. So this first one is representing Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 5. "And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.'" So scholars believe that this bear represents the Medo-Persian era, which took over Babylon after it, basically, which is what we saw in chapter 5. The fact that the bear is larger on one side than the other probably represents that Persia was bigger than the Medo, the Medo colony that helped overtake the Babylon empire there. And so that's what we're seeing here. That was chapter 5 is what we're seeing. Now look at verse 6. "After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule." Now, most scholars believe that this third animal represents Greece. A leopard with wings represents the speed at which Greece overtook the world, and that Alexander the Great was the ruler over that Greece empire, and he was able to take over basically that empire by the age of 30. So he did it extremely quick. All right? So when he took Persia in the battle, historians say that Persia lost 20,000 soldiers while Greece only lost 100 to it. So he had the wings, he was the leopard with wings. So they're saying this is Greece. Look at verse 7. It says, "After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns." Now, the fourth beast is Rome because it conquered the Greeks, all right? Its iron teeth represents Rome's incredible strength. This beast had 10 horns. Now, horns in the Bible usually represent power, the ability to do damage, right? And so that makes sense because at some point in your life, we all have had a household pet, right? Like you've had a pet living in your house, whether a hamster, a gerbil, a fish, a cat, a dog, whatever. How many of you had an animal living in your house that had a horn? Probably not, right? You never had a bull living in your house. You never had a warthog or anything like that living in your house. Because animals with horns can do damage, right? So what would happen if your cat Fluffy or your dog, Roscoe, went up against a bull with a horn? Like, it probably wouldn't win, right? Because the horn gives an advantage to the other animals. And so horns will always win basically most of the time. I know that was kind of not a great statement, always win most of the time, but you get what I'm saying. So these horned beasts represent the conquering nations, all right? So that's not hard. This is all making sense, right? We're kind of seeing the flow of this. Now, if you've been following my sermon series and haven't been falling asleep during my sermons, which I know none of you do, and so you'll notice that this vision is basically following Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue that we saw in Daniel chapter 2 of the four kingdoms. And so, but this vision adds a new detail to it. Look in verse 8 now. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. So out of Rome, it says, comes this little horn. So this is our first prophecy of the Antichrist, all right? Now, Daniel says that this horn had eyes like the eyes of a human, like the eyes of a human. They seem human, but when you look into them, it's something different. And you probably have noticed this before or seen something before, whether in movies you watched or whatever. But not only did he have the look, but he boasted and blasphemed against God. And this is our first look of what the Antichrist will look like. So what I want to do now is to move on from this vision into chapter 8, because it's basically the same vision but from a different angle. So then after we look at chapter 8, I want to kind of draw some conclusions to what all this is meaning for us, all right? So in chapter 8, the vision is about basically this 2-horned ram and a goat. Like that's basically what it is. But basically the ram gets pulverized by the goat is what happens in the story. So look in chapter 8, verse 5. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. Now, some Duke fans see this as a clear prophecy about the demise of the UNC sports program to the hands of Mike Krzyzewski. The ram gets pulverized by the goat, Mike Krzyzewski, all right? Now, that is not what this is saying even remotely, but I do like the effort. I really do, all right? Now, the 2-horned ram is the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, all right? And the goat is Alexander the Great, who again was one of the most successful conquerors who the world has ever known. Look at verse 8. The goat became very great, but at its height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Drop down to verse 16. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. And as he came near to the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand that the visions concern the end of the time. Drop down to verse 21 now. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king. The 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represents the 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. So get this. Alexander the Great actually died in his early 30s. Some say of alcoholism or whatever. But this passage said that the horn was broken. Well, when he died, there was a vicious power struggle between the 4 generals that kind of rose to power after his death. So get this. This prophecy was written 200 years before all of this happened. Okay? Look at verse 23 now. In the latter part of the region, when the rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human hands. So what we're going to see out of those four horns of Greece, a ruthless small horn will arise, especially cunning and especially violent towards God's people. Well, sure enough, around 170 BC, there was a man named Antiochus Epiphanes. Hard name to say, all right? He arose out of the four sub-kingdoms of Greece, and he was ruthless. He was basically called the Hitler of the Old Testament because he killed 80,000 Jews during his time. And so, but one day, he got a random stomach virus, and he actually died from that stomach virus, just like Daniel had predicted that he would not die by the hands of a human. Here's my point. Historians will basically agree, and theologians will agree, that it's safe to say that Antiochus Epiphanes was the specific fulfillment of this prophecy. But even though these events of Daniel 8 were fulfilled by him, both Jesus and the Apostle Paul and John, who lived 200 years after Epiphanes, used Daniel 8 to point to something in the future, namely the rise of the Antichrist. So in fact, you could say the whole book of Revelation is actually based on the vision that we see in Daniel 7 and 8. And so, which leads me to my first point, all right? So let's kind of start bringing all of this together. The prophecies of the Antichrist are already / not yet filled, okay? The prophecies of the Antichrist are already but not yet filled. For many prophecies, there's a near fulfillment and a far one that goes with it. And the near fulfillment gives us a picture of what the far one will look like. A lot of times, Old Testament prophecies talk about both fulfillments as if they are one, but they're actually separate. So think of it this way. You all have probably been to the mountains before, right? You've gone up on a mountain and you looked out and there were mountains in the distance, which looks like one mountain had two peaks, right? So you're like, oh, that's one mountain, right? Well, if you were to actually drive to that mountain, you would see that they were actually two separate mountains that were miles apart. Just from a distance, they looked very close together and looked like one mountain that had two peaks. Well, the same is true here. That's what the Old Testament prophecy looks like. The Bible presents the peaks together, but there is a near fulfillment and a far fulfillment. There's one closer and there's one farther away, even though they're kind of the same prophecy. My point is that the prophecies of Daniel 7 and 8 are both behind us and they are before us. Epiphanes was just the first fulfillment, and the Antichrist is going to be the ultimate one. Listen, the patterns of the first will be fulfilled in the second. Which leads me to my second point, that in every age, the spirit of the Antichrist is at work. Listen, the Apostle John wrote in 1 John 2:18 says, "Children, it is the last hour. You have heard that the Antichrist is coming. Even now, many Antichrists have come." So even though the ultimate Antichrist is coming, the spirit of the Antichrist is already here, which means we can learn from what we see in these chapters of what to expect in our day when that day comes. And there's three things that it says that the Antichrist will do that can help teach us of what to expect. It says in chapter 7 that the Antichrist's aim is to devour much flesh. So what does that mean? Well, that's not hard to believe and understand if you look at past history. How do you look at things like the Holocaust and just chalk it up to just merely human evil? There's something demonic about what happened in that time. Just look at Satan's work all around the world today with the slave trade and where basic human dignities are denied. The spirit of the Antichrist, which has the eyes of a human, but much worse, has its aim at devouring humanity. He is at work creating addictions, ruining relationships, leading you to self-destruction. He is working overtime and working hard to destroy humanity. So he wants to destroy that. But second, it says in verse 25 in chapter 8, it says, "He will cause deceit to prosper through his cunning, and by his influence and in his own mind, he will exalt himself." So he's wanting to deceive. He wants you to question God's word. He wants you to exalt yourself. He is at work in everything, trying to get you to question what God's word says. He is in our university classrooms. He's in our entertainment offices. He's in the newspaper offices. He's in the corporate boardrooms. He's on social media platforms. He is everywhere working to get us to doubt what God's word says. Listen, I believe Satan actually loves social media. I think it's like his favorite thing in the world. Because it's a way for us to magnify our self-obsessions and to spread all sorts of false information and to cause doubt amongst us. So in our age, we can expect the spirit of the Antichrist to be amongst us. He will try to devour you, deceive you, and cause you to exalt yourself. And here's the bad news. We can expect these things till the end of history. Like, that is just going to happen. It's not going to get better. If anything, it's probably going to get worse. And so you're saying, well, Danny, that sounds very depressing. Thank you for bringing that to my attention today. I came to church wanting to be encouraged, so now you've done your job, all right? So I do have some good news for you today, all right? And that's my next point. Third, even in the age of the Antichrist, the Ancient of Days still rules. Let me take you back to Daniel 7 again. Look in verse 9. It's the passage that we read earlier before Mike sang. Verse 9. He says, "As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair on his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were open." So God, in the midst of all of this, is calmly just taking his place as judge. Don't you just love the name of Christ, the Ancient of Days? Isn't that kind of a cool name to have? Like, I don't know. It's kind of like the phrase that we parents use when our kids to try to pull something over on us. Like, let's just say my kids come downstairs like, "Dad, by chance, I'm just curious, how do you get a stain out of a carpet?" You know, just curious. And my response back to that would be, "What have you done?" Okay, I'd be like, "I haven't said I did anything. You know, I'm just asking a normal question, and I'm just wondering, how do you get a stain out of the carpet?" My response back to that would be, "Kid, I wasn't born yesterday." Because I see through the question to what they're trying to do, right? And that's what Jesus is saying here. He's actually saying, I wasn't born yesterday. Actually, I was never born. I've always existed. I've been before time. There is nothing that I haven't seen. There's nothing that has gotten past me. Something hasn't slipped through my cracks or anything like that. I have always been. Nothing gets by him. Nothing surprises him. He never misunderstands, and nothing catches him off guard. There has never been a time in history where Jesus has not been in charge. There's just never been. It says his hair is white as snow, which means he carries the authority and the wisdom of the ages. His clothes were white and the purest wool, which means he is pure, wise, and righteous altogether, without one blot of imperfection in him. His throne blazes in fire, which means all that's before it, he's consumed. And he is alone worthy to judge the nations about what he feels he ought to do. By the way, did you notice that God's throne has wheels and they're on fire? Like, how cool is that? Like, right? Like, it says that I'm just thinking of like a tricked out monster truck look, like a throne. Like when I read that, that's what I'm thinking about. But that's communicating that the Ancient of Days is not stationary, but he's involved. He's moving around. He goes where the people are. He doesn't have to leave his throne to get there. Listen, I find it interesting that when we look at all the events, especially look at what events that Daniel predicted, let's just look at those. The times that seemed the darkest actually worked to further God's kingdom and its purposes. Let me go through those. Look at when Persia took over Babylon. It could have been dark. It's like Daniel had prospered in Babylon. He had a good life there. Everything was going good. The Persians take over. Did you know the Persians were the ones that helped rebuild Jerusalem and the temple? They actually paid for it. And did you know that Jerusalem and the temple were going to be vital to Jesus' ministry? Then, after that, God raises up Greece, right? And you would think, well, that's not good. You know, Alexander the Great, he was ruthless. That wasn't good at all. But did you know the Greeks united the world under one trade language, Koine Greek? which is what the New Testament is written in, and the whole world basically knew that language, which made it easy for the gospel to spread, and for the apostles to write so everybody could read it. Then God raised up the Romans who, get this, built a system of roads that we still find today, so that it made it possible to transport the gospel from one place to the other. The point is that God does everything for his purposes, and the good news, that's true with your life too. The good, the bad, the ugly that is in your life, it's all for his glory. And even better, Daniel tells us that one day the God who rules over the world will one day come in the world to rule. Look at verse 11 in chapter 7. Here's what it says. It says, "Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into a blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, and that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." One day, the God who is working in history invisibly will assume his throne personally. And in that moment, the power of the Antichrist will literally evaporate in front of him. Listen, a lot of times we can get caught up in these end time prophecies because we just want to know how and when and everything that's going on. Let me challenge you. The point of these prophecies is actually not to know. The reason why there's so many different theories and different kind of theologies of how it's all going to go down is because the Bible is not clear on it. And I'm okay with saying that. The point of these prophecies, they were given to people who were actually in exile. It was bad. They thought, like, God, where's the hope? Where are you? Have you forgotten about us? The point of these prophecies was not for them to know how it is going to happen and kind of all that's going to go down and for them to figure it out. The point of this prophecy was to show them what is going to happen in the future, that you don't have to lose hope in the now because we know he's on his throne. And so these end time prophecies were not meant for us to try to figure all this stuff out. And I'm never going to preach sermons to where I'm going to actually give you, like, here's how it's going to happen. It's just not going to happen from me. Because the point of these prophecies were just to give us hope in the now, to know that one day he is coming. It may be 5 minutes from now. It may be 500 years from now. It may be 5,000 years from now. We don't know. But it's just to give us the hope in the now that he is on his throne and he is coming. It doesn't matter how bad it gets now because he is still in control. That is the point of the end time prophecies. It's to give us hope in the now to know that he is still ruling. So I want to close with two applications. One is for the church and one is for those who may not know Christ. First, to the church, seeing the secret behind history may not keep you from pain, but it should keep you from panic. Okay? Listen, you might experience fear, but you should never feel frantic. Okay? The Ancient of Days is on his throne. He rules over history, and one day he has promised to come back and rule personally. He is moving everything in the world for his glory. Even though it looks like it is out of control, we know that it is not. And we can even look at past history to say that is true. Second, for those who may not know Jesus personally or have not submitted to him fully, listen, the goal of the enemy is to devour you, to destroy your faith, and to destroy you. Maybe sometimes you think, like, well, sin's going to be fun, right? But you've actually felt more devoured by sin than you've enjoyed sin, right? And maybe you felt that in your life. Sin hasn't turned out what you thought it would be like. Has he been devouring you with that? You feel hopeless, you feel frantic, you feel smothered because you feel like there's just no hope for you or no hope for this world. You can have hope and peace today in the midst of all that by trusting in the Ancient of Days, the one who has always been on his throne, the one who has always ruling, and the one that nothing has gotten past him a day in his life. Listen, you don't have to be distraught by any of this in life. All you have to do is to admit that you can't save yourself and that you need Jesus to save you. And all you have to do is to call out to him for salvation, and he will save you. So do you want that today? Do you want to have that peace that goes beyond all understanding and all the stuff that we are seeing today? If you want to do that, you'll have an opportunity to do that in just a minute. I'll be down front. I'll be one to pray with you, talk with you, whatever you need. I'll be down front to help you kind of walk through any questions that you have. Let me pray with us today. Father, thank you so much for your word, that it gives us hope in the now, Father, that you give us visions of what it's going to be like, Father. And Father, that it can give us hope to know, like, God, you are still on your throne. Father, if there's someone here today that hasn't believed and hasn't trusted in you, that God, that I just pray that they will today, that they'll see their need for you and that they'll give their life to Christ. Father, we ask all these things in your Son's name. Amen.